promised one, wasn't he? Yes, Hosanna, we shouted. Save us, we pray. I believed he was the ruler, our liberator, the long-awaited king. But now, he's dead. Were you there? Sorry, I know I must be sounding mad. I must be sounding crazy, but it's been a long day. Let me go back and explain. You see, I first met Jesus when he came to my village in Galilee. He came to our village and he began to teach about God's kingdom, and he said, God's kingdom has come. And he began to do miracles and heal people that I knew. It was like Jesus was reversing the curse of sin and sickness and death that had entered our world so long ago. The more that I began to listen to him, the more that I followed him, the more that I saw him healing other people, I began to believe that this really was the Savior, the one that was promised for so long ago. This long-awaited king who would bring God's kingdom here on earth. The ruler who would save us, who would throw off the Roman rule and lead us into victory. Victory. Palm branches. They signify victory. But it all just seems like defeat now. But I wasn't the only one that believed this. Many of us believed that Jesus was the one. Large crowds would gather to hear him teach from far and wide. They would bring their sick to him, and Jesus would touch them and heal them. Many of us believed. But the Pharisees, the chief priests, the elders, they hated him. It was written all over their face. They couldn't stand him. And the more people believed in Jesus, the more angry they became. I mean, they tried to kill him when Jesus was teaching in the temple courts. Twice. They tried to stone him. And in fact, they would question anybody. And if they found out that you believed in Jesus, they would throw you out of the synagogue. You see, they hated him. They believed he was a phony, a fake, a blasphemer, misleading the people. Well, when word spread that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, they were angry as hundreds more put their faith and trust in Jesus. And it was at that point that they became hell-bent, determined that they were going to arrest and kill Jesus. You see, I guess we all thought it could happen, but it still came as a shock when someone knocked at my door early this morning and said, Salome, wake up. They've arrested Jesus. What? What do you mean arrested Jesus? And they said, yes. A group of soldiers and officials from the chief priests and Pharisees, they went out with weapons and all, and they arrested Jesus. Wait, what do you mean? In the middle of the night? Well, how did they find him? My friend turned to me, said one word, Judas. It was Judas that led the soldiers to Jesus. Judas gave Jesus up to them. Judas. What a traitor. After everything Jesus had done for him, after Jesus had poured his whole life into Judas, well, where is he now? My friend said that they had taken Jesus, and at daybreak, they took him to be questioned by the Sanhedrin before the high priest, Annas and Caiaphas. Yeah, that's right. That's where local just cases are heard. You see, the Romans would allow the Sanhedrin to hear and to judge local disputes and to punish people according to the laws and our customs. But my friend said to me, but Salome, they've now taken Jesus to be questioned by Pilate. Pilate? That's where the Sanhedrin sends you if they think you deserve execution. You see, the Romans allow us to punish according to our laws and commands, but when it comes to execution, we're not allowed to do that. The Romans are very strict on that. They're the only ones that are allowed to issue the death penalty. This was serious. I grabbed my scarf and I ran out the door to see what I could find out about what was happening to Jesus. When I got to the palace where Pilate resides, there was already a group of Jews outside. The chief priests, the Pharisees, the elders were all there handing over Jesus to Pilate to be questioned by him. Pilate, he looked annoyed. Perhaps it was just too early in the morning for him. But he said, "What charge are you bringing against this man? Take him yourselves and judge him according to your own laws." But the Jews shouted out, "But we don't have the right to execute him. He's subverting the nation. He's telling people not to pay their taxes to Caesar. He's claiming to be Christ, a king." Pilate turned, went into the palace to go and question Jesus for himself. Meanwhile, I just stood there thinking, what was Pilate going to say? I mean, what crime did Jesus commit? What did he actually do that deserves death? He's not a traitor. He's not inciting a rebellion. He didn't tell people not to pay their taxes. That's a lie. The crowds were all murmuring all around us. And some were saying, he claimed to be the Son of God. He's a blasphemer. He deserves death. Other voices were saying, "Did you hear the time when he said he was greater than Abraham, our great father?" Blaspheme. And yet there were others that were saying, "He's not our king. We have no king but Caesar. And when Pilate hears that he's claiming to be king, surely he'll do away with him." We waited for Pilate to return. And when he came out, he announced to the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." Whew. I thought, gosh, that was close. But the crowds, they weren't satisfied. They just insisted more, that Jesus was trying to cause some kind of a rebellion. And they shouted, "This man stirs up trouble with his teaching wherever he goes, not just here, but in Judea and in the Galilee." While the Jews were shouting out all these false accusations to Pilate, my gaze was subverted to the guards that were watching Jesus. In their boredom, they decided to have a little bit of fun. They blindfolded him, and they began hitting him on the head with a stick. And they would say, "Prophesy. Come on, tell us who hit you. Was it me? Was it him? Wrong again. Let's do this over again. All right now, who hit you this time? Come on, prophesy." And again, they taunted him and mocked him like children that are bullying some weaker child in a back alley. They took advantage of this vulnerable prisoner who was at their mercy. It was disgusting. When Pilate realized that Jesus was from the Galilee, Herod's district, he sent Jesus to be questioned by Herod, who happened to be in Jerusalem at this time for the Passover feast. But Herod, he sent him back. And so Pilate once again addressed the crowds. He addressed the chief priests, the elders, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, and all the crowd. And he said, "This man, who you've accused of starting a rebellion, I have questioned him here in your presence, and I find no basis for the charge against him. Neither is Herod, for Herod sent him back, as you can see. There is nothing this man has done deserving death. Therefore, I will punish him, and I will release him." But this didn't satisfy the crowd. They only got angrier and shouted louder. Pilate addressed them, and he said, "It is your custom for me to release one prisoner during the Passover feast. Now, do you want me to release this king of the Jews?" Well, the crowd, stirred up by the chief priests, stirred up by the leaders, they all shouted, "No! We don't want him. Away with him. Give us Barabbas. Barabbas? What? Now, Barabbas really was one who incited a rebellion. He even killed someone during it. What is going on? This makes no sense. So Pilate asked, what do you want me to do with this one you claim is the king of the Jews? And the crowd began to shout, crucify him. Crucify him. Crucify him. Crucify. No. That's what you do to the vilest of criminals. That's what you do to rebellious slaves. That's what you do to foreigners, to high treason criminals. No. Pilate rightly questioned the audience, and he said, what evil has this man done to deserve death? But it became clear. The Pharisees, they weren't going to stop. And suddenly it dawned on me, this is all a farce. This is some kind of a joke, a kangaroo court. They don't want justice for Jesus or to find what he's actually done wrong and punish him for it. They want death. And because they can't give him death, they won't stop until the Romans will. Crucify him. They yelled, crucify him. Crucify him. It became clear to Pilate that he wasn't getting anywhere with this crowd. In fact, if he wasn't careful, there was going to be a riot on his hands. And then the crowd began to threaten him. And they said, if you release this man, if you release him, then you're no friend of Caesar. For anyone who claims to be king opposes Caesar. Crucify him. Crucify him. Maybe Pilate feared political repercussions of what might happen if rumors got out that someone was challenging the kingship of Caesar, but he clearly saw the crowds were more insistent, more demanding. They were wanting what they wanted, and so he gave in to their demands. He released Barabbas, and he ordered Jesus to be flogged and crucified. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? I could hardly wrap my head around the verdict. Crucify, crucify. When the soldiers violently grabbed Jesus by both arms and they ripped off his clothing and they tied his arms to this post, and they had these whips, these horrible whips in their hands. I mean, it had several strips of leather. And each piece, there was embedded a bit of metal or sheep's bone at the end. And they had these smug looks on their faces of pleasure as the two of them took turns with the full force of their weight, whipping Jesus on his back, his buttocks, and his legs. The first few beatings, it cut open his skin. He began to bleed. And with each hit, Jesus' body contorted, absorbing the blow. But as they continued to beat, the shrapnel just began to grab at the inner flesh in his back. It began to cut at his muscles. It began to claw at his back. It ripped his back into shreds. Blood was splattered. Flesh was flying. They carried on beating him, and I had to turn away. I couldn't watch. Hasn't he had enough? Isn't this enough suffering? But for the Romans, no. They just beat until that person was so weak that they could hardly stand before they sent you off to crucifixion. So they heartlessly and cruelly continued to whip and whip. Finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. I shouted out, "Stop! Enough! Stop it! You're killing him!" Finally, they dropped the whips on the ground, huffing and puffing as they wiped the sweat off their brow and the blood splattered off their arms. As if that wasn't enough, they then led Jesus over to the palace where the whole crowd of soldiers were waiting just to have their fun with this king. One of them, he twisted a crown of thorns and shoved it onto Jesus' head, and blood just began to drip down his eyes and his face from all of those holes in his scalp. Another, he forced a scepter into Jesus' hand, and still another found a purple robe and wrapped it around him, the color of royalty. And they all began to mock and laugh as they bowed down before him. "Oh, hail, the King of the Jews!" And they saluted him, "Oh, hail to the King!" And they laughed and they had their fun as if it was the funniest thing they had seen all day. I watched through the pillars of the palace as they took the scepter out of his hand and they hit him on the head. And with each hit, I cringed. And I cringed. I mean, hadn't they had enough? Was this really necessary? When they were done having their fun, they ripped off the purple robe and they threw his clothes at him and they led him away to be crucified. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? By this point, a large crowd had gathered, and they were all following the soldiers who were leading Jesus and the other two criminals who were on their way to be executed. I saw many women in the crowd weeping and wailing. I then spotted Mary Magdalene with Mary, mother of James, and Mary, mother of Jesus, and I ran over to them and I gave Mary a huge hug. "Oh, Mary, Mary." But she was cold, emotionless, as if a dagger had just pierced her heart. She was in shock. We all were in shock. Poor Mary, her firstborn son. I just grabbed her hand and I walked with her. We followed the soldiers who made each of the criminals carry their cross to the place of the skull, which is right outside the city near the busy highway. Didn't matter how weak you were, they made each of them carry their own cross. And so we watched as poor Jesus heaved this crossbeam on his shoulders, and he walked steadily. There came a point where he was just so weak, he tripped and he fell, only to be greeted by an angry Roman sandal right in the stomach. Say, "Get up, you wretched prisoner." And he spat at him in disgust. Jesus slowly made it back to his feet. And I noticed this look of determination in his eyes. As he carried on and carried on. But he was just too weak. When he fell again, the soldiers were now irritated. They were now annoyed. They grabbed a man out of the crowd and they said, "You, carry his cross for him." When we got to the place of the skull, I'll never forget the sound. I'll never forget the sound, that horrible, clinking sound. When they forced Jesus to the ground and they stretched his arms over that crossbeam and they began to take a nail and hammer it straight through his skin right under his wrists. A horrible, clanking sound. And then he let out the most torturous, awful scream. This blood-curdling scream at the agony and the pain of it. And then the soldiers, they grabbed his ankles, one on top of the other, and they began hammering again. Clank, clank, clank. This time, Jesus just shrieked. This long, agonizing, felt like minutes scream. The soldiers, They lifted the cross. It was maybe, 9 o'clock. And with a thud, the cross went into a hole in the ground. And there were these 3 half-dead-looking men hanging there. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Jesus looked up towards heaven, and I heard him say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." Forgive them? Are you kidding me? Forgive these wicked, awful Jewish leaders? Forgive them? Forgive these horrible, brutal Roman torturers? I heard voices in the background, and they were talking about how the Romans had invented and even perfected crucifixion as the most gruesome and torturous form of execution there ever was. And they were proud of it. It was publicly shaming, publicly disgracing the criminal, and a deterrent for others to see. I knew Mary heard them talking. So I wrapped my arms around Mary, and I hugged her tightly as tears just spilled, one by one by one. You think it's just common courtesy to give Jesus' belongings to his mother as a sign of respect? No. The soldiers that were on duty that day crucifying, no. They had first grabs at all the criminals' belongings. They insensitively cast lots at the foot of the cross to see who got to take home which garments. Like some kind of sick trophy. Like some kind of emblem that they'd earned or deserved from a hard day's work. There was one soldier who offered Jesus some wine mixed with myrrh as a type of painkiller. But Jesus, he refused it. He was insistent that he was going to experience the full pain on that cross, not to numb it one bit. And I know it was painful. You could see. Even just to breathe, he had to push on that nail with his foot and pull up with his arms. Every breath was more labored than the one before. But in his pain, he still selflessly thought of others. He looked down at Mary from the cross, and he saw John, his beloved disciple, and he said, "Dear woman, this is your son." And he said to John, "This is your mother." Even in his pain, he wanted to make sure his mother was cared for after he died. Pilate had inscribed some inscriptions to be hung on each criminal's cross. On these inscriptions was written the name of the criminal and where they were from and what charge they had against them. I can't remember the names of the guys on the right and the left, where they were from, but their charge said, robber. Robber. You know what Jesus' inscription said? It said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. What was his crime? Being a king. A king. I just remember it was Sunday, and the crowds were chanting, "Blessed be the King of Israel. Hosanna to the Son of David, the one who will sit on the throne and reign forever and ever, the King." And now the chants of the crowd, it's just chants of mockery, of scorn, of people walking down the road and seeing Jesus hanging on the cross and wagging their heads and saying, "You said that you would destroy this temple and in 3 days you would raise it up." Well, save yourself. Get yourself down off that cross. They would laugh. The chief priests, they were all talking amongst themselves, also mocking and laughing. And they said, he saved others. Can't even save himself. Get yourself down off that cross if you're really the Christ, the Son of God, the King of Israel. Then we'll believe in you. We watched. Us ladies, we stood there watching. It must have been maybe noontime, but the whole sky turned dark, purplish, like the whole earth was bruised, like the very earth itself was burdened and mourning what was happening to Jesus. Jesus, his heart struggled to pump every ounce of blood in his body. His lungs struggled to breathe in oxygen. His body fought to cling to life. The hours seemed to drag on and on. But finally, about 3:00, Jesus looked up towards heaven and he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. It is finished. And that was it. He was dead. Gone. I mean, I guess I half expected that God would rescue him from the cross, or angels would come down and take him off the cross, but my victorious king was dead. Women beat their breast at the sight in anguish and walked away. But for those of us who knew him, we just stood at a distance, staring, watching this lifeless body hanging there. So empty, so void, so hopeless. Sabbath was approaching, and so the Jews said, we can't leave these bodies up here for the Sabbath. Sabbath starts at dusk, according to our timing, and so they spoke to the soldiers. I guess these crucifixions can linger for hours and hours, even days, if the Romans provide a platform for the criminals to rest their weight on. So to hasten death, the soldiers took these sledgehammers and just smacked the legs of the first guy, crushing them. Smacked the legs of the second guy, crushing his legs too. But when they got to Jesus, they saw he was already dead. Instead, they took a sword, kind of like a spear, and they pierced him in the side, and blood and water came flowing out. It was clear. He was dead. His heart stopped pumping. His blood already began to separate. This one sweet man, he's a lovely man who also followed Jesus. He was a very wealthy man named Joseph of Arimathea, and he went to Pilate, and he asked Pilate for permission to take down Jesus' body and to put him into this new grave that had been cut out of the stone, never been used before, right in the garden next door. Pilate gave him permission. And so Joseph, with the help of Nicodemus, carefully brought the body down off of the cross, and they began to carry him to the place where the tomb was. Us ladies, we all followed. We followed along where the tomb was, and we saw them wrapping up Jesus' body in linens, and they placed his dead body on a cold stone slab inside. And they rolled a stone in front of the tomb, closing it off. We didn't even have time. We didn't even have time to prepare funeral spices and perfumes to embalm the body like was proper. We had to hurry and get home for the Sabbath. That's according to our tradition. That's the day when we rest. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? So now I'm walking home from this horrible day with lots of thoughts swirling into my head. And the words of the prophet Zechariah just keep coming back to me. See your king coming to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey. And I just think, surely he really was the king, wasn't he? But now he's dead. I don't know. I thought he was king. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was wrong.